So in the last lesson, we were discussing about the overview about the DNS services. So what exactly a DNS server and basically how the name resolution works and basically the domain or basically a hierarchy, what we call as FQDN hierarchy. In this lesson, we'll talk about what the services or the DNS services have been provided by Azure and how we can basically use them. So Azure provides two different, basically two types of basically DNS zones. So DNS zone is nothing but it's basically a service which maintains the DNS records. So whatever we called as an which we see called as an A record, then CNAME record, then MX record, then like in text record, then SPF record, whatever we talked about in the earlier classes, maybe. Okay. So this DNS zone basically maintains the DNS records for a specific domain. So a DNS zone represents a specific domain, a domain. So that domain name can be a external domain name or public domain name, or it can be a private DNS domain name. So normally we call it like an acutelearn.com, something these what we call as domain names, which it maintains a DNS records for these ones. Now this provides in two types. One is a public DNS zones. So this can be used for public domain names, domain names. So it can maintain, basically it can allow us to create or basically maintain the DNS records for the public domain names. So if you have registered your domain name with some vendor, okay, if you have registered your domain with some vendor, then you can basically have a public DNS configured in Azure, which can maintain the DNS records for your public. So as I was discussing in the earlier class, the top level domain DNS servers can route the traffic to the Azure public DNS services and provide the information for the clients. Now this public DNS zones is only for external domains. So across the globe, these DNS zones are being. So now what happens in the background, the Azure will provide a DNS servers in the backend, basically servers in the background. So we'll not have access to the DNS application, but over the web portal, we can create a DNS records and we can manage DNS records in this one. But we need to have some kind of a domain which is publicly available. Now we have another kind of this thing called as private DNS zones. Private DNS zones. So in Azure, so we have virtual network. So within the virtual network, there could be a lot of resources, maybe servers, machines are existing. Now we want to have our own DNS domain name and maintain DNS records within the virtual network or within the corporate network. Now, what happens here now? So there could be a lot of resources which reside inside this network, like virtual machines. Okay, and these virtual machines might be running some different kind of applications which are internally accessible within the Azure virtual network. and other places. Now, what is the advantage of that is now even for your internal applications which are running within your Azure environment, so you can have a DNS server which can be provided. So this private DNS zone, the private DNS zone maintains DNS records. So which is again like in A record, host record, then CNAME record, whatever the DNS records it reflect, and whatever we called as an MX record, then SPF record, whatever we called as a text record, etc., etc. It maintains all these records. So the private DNS zone can be connected to virtual network. Virtual network. Now the name resolution happens within that virtual network. So any of the machines which are there within this virtual network, when they try to access using the fully qualified domain name, then that will be the DNS service. Basically, the DNS zone can respond to the DNS queries which are available in this one. So now what happens here now, a DNS service can be attached to this network. The private DNS, so this will act like a DNS server for this virtual network. This will act like a DNS server for this particular virtual network. So when we power on these particular devices in this virtual network, so the Azure will automatically can register this particular device into the DNS server. It can create a DNS record in the DNS server. It can create a DNS record in the DNS server. And any kind of DNS requests which are being performed here, basically. So this DNS server can serve that particular DNS request. So we don't need to install a DNS application inside any of the virtual machines. We can create a private DNS zone and we can attach that private DNS zone to a virtual network. And we can create a DNS records and which can be resolved within this particular virtual network. But the private DNS zone, if I come out from this virtual network, if I ping from an internet, then this DNS domain zone will not resolve because this is a private internal to the virtual network. Okay. Now, automatically when we power on the virtual machines, once we connect the DNS zone to a virtual network, the next time onwards, wherever we power on a machine or create a machine, automatically that machine will point to this private DNS server. So we have, when you go to the DNS in the Azure portal, we see DNS zones, private DNS zones. The DNS zones are the public DNS zones and the private DNS zones are the private ones. Private ones. So when I go to the DNS zones, the private DNS zones, this is a public DNS zone. If we have registered any kind of a public domain, we can create a public DNS zone. So let me create a resource group, then give me a domain name called as an acutelearn.net or co.in or something, whatever, if there is something called as a public domain. The location where I want to create this DNS service, I'm selecting in South India, review and create. This is simple like in your GoDaddy DNS service or some other third-party providers which are providing the DNS services for your domains. So now, so we got the public DNS zone got created. Now we can see the name servers, the DNS servers, the backend. So this DNS zone is running on these DNS servers. Means that backend, it is running a DNS application on these particular servers, and they got synchronized on all these four things. Now we can create a record set. So we can see under acute-learn, I can say www.acute-learn.co.in and a record, whatever record type of record you want it, and to which particular IP address it points to the. So you can specify the IP address. Now we can see called as a DNS record, which is basically pointing over here. Created. But however, this is not my public DNS domain name. So even if I type from my internet, it will not get resolved because it is not a public domain name. So if I say acutelearn.co.in, it is given a different IP address, but it is not there. So it is basically an, yeah. So like this, we can create a public DNS zones, and we can, now what we can do is now, so we have to go to the domain register and change the DNS servers pointing to these DNS servers. Let's say if I go to the GoDaddy, so as of now, the acutelearn.co.in is available in GoDaddy, and we see the DNS services are being provided by GoDaddy. But however, I just created a DNS zone in Azure. Now I want the name resolution should happen from the Azure. Now we can go to the manage and we would see a name servers. So we see a name servers. Now we're saying use default name servers. These are GoDaddy ones. Now we can change name servers. So I'll use my own name servers. Now I can take the Azure name server. And I can take the another name server. I can add, as Microsoft is giving 4 DNS servers, because the criticality of that is in save it. Now it would take roughly around 12 to 48 hours of time. So it is saying that as invalid top level domain name. So we just need to remove this. Okay. So now the DNS servers got updated. Now it would take roughly around 12 to 48 hours of time, okay, to update pointing to the new DNS servers. Okay, so now as we see that, but however, across the globe, it should get updated. When I say ping www.gooden.com, it's still pointing to the old DNS server. Okay. Now I'm saying a record set called as some email dot missing. I'm giving it 138.128. Like this, we can create a DNS records. But once the name servers got changed, then we would see that the response from these DNS zones will be there is. So it is going to the old DNS server. So it takes 24 to 48 hours of time to get updated. That's how you can create a DNS zone, and you can change your existing DNS servers pointing to the Microsoft DNS. Then wait for 24 to 48 hours of time. And then whatever the records which you create, then they get reflected across the globe and it will be resolvable. But in many cases, what happens is So we don't, let me revert back by changes. So I say change in my this thing. I don't want to use that. So I just say save it. I'm reverting back my changes. Okay. I'm just deleting this DNS zone because it's chargeable. Right. Now let's go to the virtual networks. Let me create a virtual network. I'm giving it VM1. Let me create a subnet. So we create a virtual network. I'm just trying to create two virtual machines. We create a virtual network. In which subscription? Yeah, Ramana subscription. Oh, the name of the network we gave is VM1. Sorry, it's a bit confusing. Let me delete it. I'm giving it VNet-1. Let me go to virtual machines. Subnet 1. Let me create one more virtual machine. Let's say I have the VMs created. Let's first test the DNS. Let me take the IP address. I'm connected to the first VM. I'm connected to the second VM. So I'm in the first VM. Let me disable. I'm saying host name VM1. I'm trying to ping VM2.acutland.net. Now we can see that it says could not find a host because we have not created any DNS zone called as acutland.net and connected to this VNet. I'm trying to do that, but it is not allowing me. So I'm going to the another server. I'm saying ping vm1.acutland.net. So we'll see that it is giving you could not find host. So now how we can have the private DNS zones. So let's go to the search for private DNS zones. Create a private DNS zones. Create it. So what is the domain which you want to have it? I'm giving a domain name called as an acutland.net is my private DNS domain name, which is used within my virtual network. So I'm just going to the DNS zone. We can see private DNS zone, which is acutland.net. Now we have options is providing you the DNS server details. Now we can see virtual networks links. Now you can connect this private DNS zone to a virtual network. I'm saying called as a VNet one. I'm selecting the VNet. Enable auto registration. So this will enable whenever we create a new resource, automatically it will create a DNS record and the private DNS zone. Now we connected this a DNS zone to this VNet. Now, if we create any kind of resources within this VNet, or next time when we reboot it, it'll automatically create a DNS record, and all these resources will use this DNS zone for name resolution. Okay. So we just connected to this one. I'm just going to the record sets. Now we don't see any other records as of now. Now let me go to the virtual machines and reboot it. Let me reboot both the machines. Now we can see here, there are two DNS records got created automatically because we enabled auto registration. Now vm1.acutland.net is pointing to an IP called as 17.16.04. vm2.acutland.net is pointing to an IP called as 17.16.1.4. As we enabled an auto registration, then it automatically got First name. I'm saying ping vm2.acutelearn.net. Now we can see that it is pointing to n1.4 IP address. It is resolving to an IP address called as 1.4 because there is a DNS records existing in the private DNS zone, and these machines are basically contacting that DNS zone and getting the IP address. So basically getting the resolution. Now this way we can create a private DNS zones and we can basically connect to a virtual network. Now when we do an ipconfig/all, now we'd see the DNS servers are basically some 168 series, which is basically ARPA series. Now let's take the third case of it. In a third case of that, you don't want to use Azure private DNS, but in one of the virtual machine, you installed a DNS application. In a third case of that, we don't want to use a private DNS zone. But what happens here now? So there is one Windows VM or some Linux VM. So we are running a DNS application inside this particular VM, which is having an IP address called it's in some 172.16.1.250. Now running a DNS application. Now, if these machines should use this DNS server, now the DNS IP address should point to this particular DNS server. Now, by default, the DNS server IP will be in the series of 168 series something, which is in this thing. But in our case, we want to use one of the server which is there in, or a VM which is in the network, which is going to act like a DNS server. Now, all these machines which we are going to do that should point to this particular DNS server. Now, where do we copy? Where do we update it? Now, in that kind of situations, first let me disconnect the private DNS zone. We need to disconnect this. Now let me delete this DNS zone. Okay, it takes some time to update. Now let's go to the virtual networks. I'm going to the virtual network. On the virtual networks, down we can see DNS servers. Now by default is an Azure provided. That is where 168.series will be applicable. But in our case, so I want the DNS server IP address pointing to this server, which is 1.250. So what we can do here now, we can do a custom and we can specify the custom DNS server IP address. And save it. So now in this case, what happens is so when explicitly we are specifying a DNS server IP addresses. So when we create any kind of a resource within this virtual network, or when we reboot any kind of a resource within this virtual network, The DNS IP address will be this one. So I gave 120. So it will be 120 IP address. Now let me go to this machine. So as of now, we would see 168.30 now. Now let me reboot this machine and see what is the new DNS IP address which it is going to get. So I'm just rebooting both the machines. Typically, in many cases, what happens is that you might have some AD servers, the domain controllers running inside the Azure virtual machines. Now you need to point the DNS server IP address pointing to the domain controllers. Okay, and for all the machines, you need to specify the IP address of the domain controller as a DNS IP address. In such kind of situations, you can go to the virtual network. Then you can go to the DNS servers and you can specify the domain controller IP addresses. Okay, then the name resolution will start basically, or the machines will start pointing to your domain controllers. Now we can see the DNS IP address. Earlier it was something like an 168 dot something. Now as we explicitly specified the DNS IP address on a virtual network, now it is getting 107.16.1.120 IP address. Okay. So that's how you can use the DNS services. So either you can create, if you have a requirement for a public DNS service, then you can create a public DNS job. And if there is a requirement for a private DNS services, and you can use the private DNS zones. Or if you already have a DNS server running inside the virtual machines, then you want to point that virtual machines or the resources to this particular DNS server. Then on the virtual network, we can go and basically update the DNS records. This way, we can basically use the Azure DNS servers on the virtual network. So the next class we'll look at, basically the session we'll look at the Azure firewall.